After my first 3 film reviews were all from critically acclaimed director Akira Kurosawa, I took a brief break from Kurosawa to cover some other interesting works, such as Kuroneko and Heaven and Earth. Yet now we are returning to Kurosawa once again for arguably one of his finest films ever. One that I have been eagerly awaiting to cover, yet have been waiting for the right moment in my main Sengoku Jidai history series. If you have been watching my main Sengoku Jidai history series, you should know that in my latest episode, The Battle of Mikatagahara, the legendary warlord Takeda Shingen tragically died in 1573 while marching west to take on Oda Nobunaga. After he passed away, the Takeda clan desperately attempted to keep his death a secret, using decoys and word of mouth to fool their enemies. It is this story that Kurosawa tells us in his 1980 classic, Kagemusha. The 1970s had not been a good decade for director Akira Kurosawa. After directing a plethora of acclaimed films throughout the 1950s and 60s, his career became troubled. Dissatisfied with the stagnant Japanese film industry and having suffered an embarrassing incident with Hollywood during the production of the 1970 film Tora Tora Tora, Kurosawa had become depressed, struggling to create anything new and fearing he may never be able to direct another film. Kurosawa even attempted to commit suicide. In 1977, the landscape of cinema changed forever with the release of Star Wars. And with it, its creator, George Lucas, became a household name. Lucas, as well as many other popular filmmakers in the United States, had actually been largely influenced by Kurosawa's earlier work. Thus, when Lucas learned that Kurosawa had been struggling to direct anything new in Japan, Lucas reached out to him. Kurosawa had his heart set on making another massive samurai epic. However, the film he truly wanted to make and the film that actually was made are two different things. Kurosawa had been dreaming of creating what will later be known as Ran, his 1985 samurai classic, which I have also covered on the channel. However, he realized that before he could dive back into the risky waters of adapting Shakespeare to feudal Japan, he would need to prove he can still pull off a safer samurai epic. Thus, the concept he brought before Lucas was that of Kagemusha, the story of Takeda Shingen's body double who attempts to keep the ruse that Shingen still lives long after his death. Kagemusha would still of course be a massive samurai epic, yet we can see in retrospect that it may have been a simple stepping stone for Kurosawa, as he later stated that in actuality he felt that Kagemusha was really just a dress rehearsal for Ran. Lucas, after viewing the screenplay and looking over many of the scene illustrations Kurosawa had painted himself, was fascinated by the concept and agreed to help get this film made. Kurosawa had originally attempted to get Toho Studios to finance the project, yet when he failed to acquire enough funding, Lucas was able to convince 20th Century Fox to aid in financing the film. Also, Lucas brought on fellow director and Kurosawa fan Francis Ford Coppola to co-produce the film. So, then with everything falling into place, shooting for Kagemusha began in July of 1979. Once released, the film itself would forever be remembered as one of Kurosawa's most interesting works. While many of his films are either adaptations of famous novels and plays, or fresh creative works sprouted from his own mind, Kagemusha is unlike anything he had ever made before, simply due to how it attempts to follow real history. And in my opinion, this is one of the film's greatest strengths, while also its greatest weakness. And this is because I believe the story can be hard to invest yourself in if you don't understand the history surrounding it. I remember watching this film back when I was younger, and honestly I didn't enjoy it. At the time I preferred films like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, and I wasn't catching the same energy in this film that those films had. And certainly that can be attributed to the fact that those films actually have much more action and are certainly more straightforward in their pacing and storytelling. Yet after studying Japanese history and repeatedly watching the film, I can now say that I genuinely feel that Kagemusha is much better when you actually understand the history of what is going on in the story. As with each repeated viewing, I find myself loving it more and more, but I cannot stress enough that having that understanding helped me appreciate this piece so much more. That may not be the case for other viewers who are able to become immersed in it without knowing the historical context, although it was definitely necessary for me. So then, what actually is the context? Well, let's dive into history and the plot to better understand. As we have seen in my main Sengoku Jidai history series, the political landscape of Japan in the early 1570s was intense. For over 100 years, the country had been at war with itself, as local samurai warlords known as the daimyo from across the land had risen up to claim power for themselves. Yet by 1573, a daimyo named Oda Nobunaga had risen up to seize the capital, beginning a campaign to restore peace to the nation by conquering all who stood against him. Desperate to end Nobunaga's reign of tyranny, the shogun, who was supposed to be in charge of the samurai class, yet was being overpowered by Nobunaga, reached out to various lords across the country in a call for aid against the Oda. And in 1572, arguably the greatest threat to Nobunaga's power, the Takeda clan of the East, answered the call and marched off to war. By that point, their leader, Takeda Shingen, had become a legendary figure, conquering several provinces and exercising his might against his eastern rivals. And although the early stages of his campaign fared well, tragedy would strike in the spring of 1573, when he unfortunately died. Although the actual circumstances of his death are not entirely known, one plausible scenario, and the one that Kurosawa goes with in Kagemusha, is that he was shot by a sniper during the siege of Noda Castle. This is really where the film begins its own story. And while it turns into historical fiction, it's fantastically done historical fiction. Takeda Shingen's brother, Takeda Nobukado, stumbles upon a petty thief who had been captured and awaiting punishment. He noticed that this thief bore a striking resemblance to the Lord Takeda Shingen, and could be used as an effective decoy. Yet after he is shot, but before he dies, he asks the rest of his commanders to keep his death a secret for at least 3 years, which would allow the clan's stability to remain intact, while also keeping the clan's enemies at bay. Of course, rumors begin to fly that Shingen is indeed dead, which reach the ears of Oda Nobunaga, Ieyasu Tokugawa, and Uesugi Kenshin. Although these remain to be just rumors, as the appearance of the body double truly begins to baffle the enemies of the Takeda clan, unsure whether he is really alive or not. However, if you know anything about Japanese history, you know that this film won't have a happy ending. While the ruse works as intended for a while, eventually the truth gets out, and spearheading the great reveal is none other than Takeda Katsuyori, the would-be head of the Takeda clan, who is instead thrown to the wayside as the Takeda commanders attempt to prop up the decoy, aka the Kagemusha. Katsuyori is an interesting figure, as history often remembers him as brash and foolhardy, leading the clan into the military disaster that is the Battle of Nagashino. Yet we can also see from history that Katsuyori was also a competent commander, seizing castles through calculated methods. Of course, for the sake of the film, he is once again depicted as aggressive and reckless. And it is at the Battle of Nagashino where, tragically, the film wraps up, as the Takeda army under the command of Katsuyori is annihilated by the Oda. Now, while a large portion of the film is concentrated on the politics of Japan and the war between the Takeda and the Oda, the film truly focuses on the story of the double, the Kagemusha. And it's here we get a genuinely unique adaptation of the commonly used hero's journey trope. For those of you who don't know, the hero's journey is a set path many protagonists find themselves on in narratives. And there is no finer example of a character on a hero's journey than Luke Skywalker in A New Hope, being presented with an amazing opportunity for greatness, yet being unsure of himself and unwilling to embark on his great adventure. He eventually gains the motivation to rise to the challenge and stalwartly work towards achieving his full potential. It's this very character arc that our main protagonist in Kagemusha must endure, first being unwilling to play the role of Shingen's double. Yet, having a deep inner conflict within himself, he discovers a life worth living, a life greater than the one he was dealt, eventually choosing to faithfully take up the role of Shingen. What makes his character even better is that he is portrayed by the brilliant Tatsuya Nakadai. Much like Toshiro Mifune, Nakadai has a rich history of playing samurai on film, and would later go on to star in Kurosawa's Ran. He's a fantastic actor and a great choice for the role. Yet what is fascinating is that he wasn't even who was initially supposed to play the double. Originally, Shintaro Katsu, the actor best known for playing Zatoichi, was meant to play the Kagemusha. Yet Katsu and Kurosawa got off to a very bad start when Katsu wished to film and document his own performance on Kagemusha for an acting class he was involved with. This prompted the dismissal of Katsu. 20th Century Fox pressed Kurosawa to bring on another internationally known Japanese actor to play the role. And since Kurosawa had distanced himself from the legendary Toshiro Mifune, Nakadai eventually ended up with the part, playing both Shingen and his Kagemusha. And what a fantastic choice it was, as I honestly could not see anyone else starring in the role. Yet Nakadai is not the only actor who, in my opinion, gives a knockout performance. Daisuke Ryu, who plays Oda Nobunaga, is simply outstanding. This, in my opinion, is the definitive depiction of Nobunaga. He carries such an intense and abrasive aura, foregoing the usual depiction most portrayals give, showcasing Nobunaga as calm and sophisticated. Ryu's performance truly shows us a man on a mission. He absolutely feels like the unorthodox and ambitious figure history remembers him as, while also depicting his love and interest with Europe. Of course, Oda Nobunaga is not the only major historical figure outside of the Takeda clan that we see in the film, as we also see much of Ieyasu Tokugawa, and a brief appearance by Uesugi Kenshin. Although interestingly enough, I've heard that the Japanese release of Kagemusha actually features much more of Uesugi Kenshin. So if anyone has seen the Japanese release of the film, I'd love to hear if that is true, and what your thoughts are on the additional scenes, as I hope to one day track down a Japanese copy of the film for myself. Moving on now, I want to talk about the editing and cinematography. Kagemusha once again is classic Kurosawa, incorporating long takes and calculated framing. There are moments that do feel clunky and that linger a little too long on something you are unsure if is important or not. Yet as a whole, it is artfully crafted and a treat to the eyes. Although, in an epic as grand as Kagemusha, a common thought is that the battles must be fantastic as well. But unfortunately, that is a misconception, simply because we aren't shown a ton of fighting. We do get shown scenes of battle here and there, and while they are each showcasing interesting and stylistic cinematography, we don't ever see anything as grand or epic as the scale of the battles in, say, Ran or Heaven and Earth. And it honestly bums me out a bit, especially in the case of Nagashino, as that is one of the most significant battles in Japanese history, yet we barely see any of it, mostly resulting in Kurosawa detailing the tragic loss of life at the end. It's even more maddening when George Lucas in an interview stated that Kurosawa actually filmed much more of the battle, using tons of special effects, yet when it came to actually editing the film together, much of it was cut and left out. However, with that said, the film truly excels in regards to its costume design and sets, transporting you seamlessly into feudal Japan. What adds to the immersion is the fact that many Japanese museums actually loaned samurai armor to the film studio during the production, essentially meaning that some of the armor we see in the film is in fact real samurai armor. That's cool. Now, the final thing I usually like to touch on before I wrap things up is the music. And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely happy with the score composed by Shinichiro Ikebe. It definitely works, and the main theme is memorable, yet I don't feel it necessarily aged well. Although, with that said, I do believe it fits perfectly at the end when we are shown the scores of bodies left on the field at Nagashino. Having covered that, let's now move on to the film's final rating. When all said and done, I give Kagemusha 3.5 stars out of 4. It's near perfection, telling a brilliant and unique tale of self-discovery rooted in history. It's tragic and somber, but in all the right ways, and I highly recommend watching it for anyone who has yet to see it. The only reason I don't give Kagemusha a perfect rating is because I feel that you really need to know the historical context to better invest and immerse yourself in the story, as otherwise viewers may need to repeatedly watch the film or dive into Japanese history to better understand what is going on outside of the main character's story. And although it's a personal gripe, I am also saddened by the lack of a larger scale depiction of Nagashino. What we received definitely fit the flow of the film, although the fanboy in me still wishes we were able to see a massive recreation of one of the most famous battles in Japanese or even world history. And on a final note, I want you to remember that Kurosawa considered this film as sort of a stepping stone for Ran, which is an incredibly interesting notion when you compare both films side by side. That is something I may come back to make a video on in the future. But as always, have you seen Kagemusha? If so, what do you think of it? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most entertaining.